part of my conversation with Diana Rose, our music director, as we prepare for this Friday night Shabbat, was that I wanted to have joy in our music, in our sanctuary, in our space on this Shabbat. I felt like last Shabbat we decided to have a mellow Shabbat musically, and a Shabbat that was deeply meditative, ahead of the meditation retreat. This time I wanted a little more joy. We're even going to get to dance at the end. So I hope you brought your dancing shoes. But then I had second thoughts. I asked myself, how can we be joyous in times like these? Is it really even ethical to be joyous in times like these? Isn't joy an expression of denial, a lack of care, an ignoring of the situation? How can we be joyous when our institutions are under attack, when our planet is falling apart, when our democratic institutions are unraveling in front of our eyes and barely hanging by a thread at this point? How can we be joyous when violence is being wrought upon our own people, the minorities who live in this land, who are seeking to make a life for themselves in our neighborhoods? Minorities of colors, strangers, the foreigners, the immigrants. When we also wrought violence in other places of the world, all of that in our name. All of that in our name. How can we be joyous? Wouldn't be joy, in fact, an expression of our white privilege? And as those questions were not leaving me alone, I remembered a conversation that I had several weeks ago with Millard Petersky of blessed memory. I went to see him in the hospital, and I walked into the room, and he was trying to keep his mind off of his disease, and was watching TV. And on TV, these days, was the foretold conclusion of the impeachment proceedings. And we both knew, even weeks ago, what the end of that charade was going to be. And we entered into this very powerful conversation, he and I. And he told me this story of his father and mother-in-law who escaped Germany just in time in the early 1930s. And he recalled a conversation he had, I think, with his father-in-law, if I remember correctly, if he remembered correctly, some years later, about what was the telltale sign that in 1932, 1933 you decided it's time to go. Like, what was it that was the straw? And he recalled her father-in-law telling him, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but something to the extent of, it's when you realize that the Constitution has been completely erased and eradicated and that there's no law that can save you and protect you, that's when you know you have to leave. And that really kind of stayed with me in the days that followed that. That was just a day or two before our last Shabbat service. And at the Oneg last Shabbat service, I was recalling that story with one of our members as we were as we were having a little bit of a nosh. And the reaction was actually a gorgeously beautiful reaction to bring up the truth that for people of color in this country, for minorities in this country, the Constitution really has never worked. The Constitution has never been anything of a protective kind. And that though we now are deploring its unraveling, members of minorities and minorities of color especially have already lived through what we might be living through a long time ago. In fact, the Constitution was never ever there for them. And so how can we be joyous? Al echad kama v'kama, our rabbi would say, even the more so. How can we nonetheless be joyous? Wednesday is my one day off. And on Wednesday I went with my wife I like to go when it rains like it does, I like to go spend time in the movie theaters. And we went and saw Just Mercy on Wednesday. It's a movie, if you don't know, it's the movie of the true story of this lawyer, African-American lawyer Brian Stevenson, who is very popular now because his group and his work has had a huge impact on our society. But the movie recalls the earliest days of his work, and it's a movie that is based on his book, actually, which is also highly recommended. It's a glorious movie. It's a beautiful movie. Please go see it. Spend the time. It's still in the theaters. I'm in shock, though not so much that he wasn't nominated for the Academy Awards. But it's beautiful. It's gorgeously acted. It's poignant, and it's a story of truth. And we need to tell the truth these days before it disappears. And what it shows, it shows really the failing of the Constitution to protect African American minorities, specifically in the case of this movie, in the South. The movie takes place mostly in Alabama. But we know that had actually not been relegated just to the South, that it has been really in many places in the North as well, where justice and the power structure is in fact stacked against minorities. And it shows how, and this, mind you, happens in 1997. It's not that far away. It shows how the justice system, the police system, all the system of power and justice is through and through permeated with racism. And so this fresh out of law school lawyer who comes from Connecticut and sets up shop in the South is up against what he has no idea what he's up against. And so the movie shows setback after setback in his attempt. So his attempt is to, mostly in the movie, to free inmates on death row, African American inmates on death row that have been wrongly accused, wrongly imprisoned, most of the time set up because they were black, to take the fall for things they've never done, oftentimes murders, rapes. And he sets out to actually, in the movie we know he saves at least 2 of them from being on death row. Ultimately, by now, he saved about 450, 460 people from being on death row, wrongfully accused because of racism, because of endemic racism. And the movie shows the devastation that he experiences, because even if he's able, as he is able, to show and demonstrate and bring evidence and bring testimonies that one of his clients is in fact innocent of the murder he's being accused of, because even the person who testified against his client recanted, right? He lied in the original trial. And even with all that evidence, the judge, the white supremacist, deeply racist judge, decides that, no, he's not going to reopen the case and he's not going to declare that it needs a second trial. Questioning the validity of the testimonies of now the one who recanted and the validity of all the amassed proof that in fact that man did not commit that crime. It did not matter. It did not matter. It did not matter. Just like what we have seen on our televisions and the overwhelming proof of the malfeasance of our president, this in the end did not matter. It does not matter. It does not matter. And so you can imagine that Bryan Stevenson at that point in the movie is completely depressed. I mean, I'm not even telling you about the attempt on his life and the threats that he's been receiving. And anyone who has been willing to participate in supporting his effort is deeply depressed, is in a very low point in his life. And he decides, there's a scene where he finds himself on Sunday morning in a black church in Alabama with the community that he's been serving in the context of this trial. And you see the gospel choir just alight and singing and dancing and rejoicing. There is palpable joy on their faces, and the whole congregation is on their feet and swaying in the air and also singing at the top of their lungs and smiling and laughing. And it's just an incredible scene of joy, of unbridled joy. And in the middle of that is Bryan Stevenson, somber, looking down and sitting. Because he's in the same place I am. He's like, how can we be joyous? How can we dance? How can we sing? And the whole time was he's wrestling, though he's himself African American, though he's part of this community, he's from the north, and he's wrestling, some of the jokes in the movie are like, well, you're one of us, but you're from the north. How can you and really truly understand, though your street looked like our street, though your experience was very similar as our experience, there is still. And so is this wrestling for him is like, how can I put myself in the mindset of those people who have lived for generation and generation since the beginning of slavery, which happened 400 years ago? How can I get in that mindset? And he looks around and he sees these people that have been for generations devastated, murdered, raped, and of course, enslaved, and he sees that joy, and that's the shift for him. That's the shift for him when he begins to realize what in fact these people are teaching him in this moment about them, about themselves, about the people they have become, about the strength of the people they have become. Because he realizes that strength, that joy that is expressed right now is in fact their commitment to the ideals of this nation of ours. It's actually not how those ideals have not manifested yet, but the commitment to the ideals themselves. Their joy and their power stems from the root that they hold this truth to be self-evident, as declared in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. And their force, their power, lies in the fact that after so many generations, they are still there. They are the force to hold those declarations, to hold those sentiments, to hold those ideals in the face of the rest of America. And through blood and guts and disasters and massacres and shootings and hangings to still be there and sing, to still be there and stand in their power and said, we are still putting that in front of you. You have yet to reach those ideals that you have declared in 1776, and we'll be here continuing to sing and to dance and to praise and hallelujah until the day that all of America manifests and in truth those ideals in their world and in our nation. And that's the click for him. The click of the power of these people. That against all odds, against everything that has happened, they are still standing and they're still dancing and they're still singing and they're still filled with joy and hope and dedication and strength. They are immovable. And he rises from his despair and begins to see a smile on his face and begins to join in because he remembers that hymn from when he was a kid. And he also attended black churches in his neighborhood. And he remembers the hymn and he starts singing and dancing and swaying with them. And you know this is the moment that everything shifts in the movie, where he knows that he has to play the long game. That he doesn't matter right now. He has to play the long game and he's got to go above the head of the petty, racist, white supremacist system that exists in the cities where he's fighting the fight. And he goes above everybody's head to the Supreme Court of, well, I don't want to give up all the rest of the movie. You really have to go and see it. What struck me is the power of the narrative at the core of how this African American community is depicted and how this narrative, this incredibly powerful narrative that we will overcome. It's not sang in that movie, but it's a subtitle of all of it, right? And the resilience in the face of so much trauma. And I was thinking about this week's Torah portion. Because everything always brings me back to this week's Torah portion. Because we too have that narrative. And we forget, but we are born on that narrative. The narrative of an oppressed people, enslaved under the thumb of Pharaoh, that breaks free. And in this week's Torah portion, cross the sea and find themselves freed and liberated on the other side of the waters, singing and dancing with Miriam and the timbrels. And I thought, we need to reclaim that narrative. We need to bring this narrative full front in front of us. That we are the people who, over the 2,500 years of our history, have met Pharaoh after Pharaoh after Pharaoh after Pharaoh. That we too were enslaved in most, if not all, the places we eventually landed. That we faced massacres and pogroms. That we faced extinction, in fact. But because we are grounded in this narrative of freedom, in this narrative of liberation, we have supported ourselves, we have continued despite the worst that can happen to any nation. And we have stood our ground, and we have continued to give every nation in which we have landed the best of ourselves, the best of our minds, the best of our hearts, the best of our spirit. We have continued to give. We have continued to stand. We have continued to sing our faith, our tradition. And I believe that now is the time to join hands with those who are oppressed, those who are neglected, those who are pushed down. And I know what we are forgetting it. I know this Israeli government is completely forgetting our narrative, our founding narrative. And because it has forgotten that we are a people that came to this world saying, free yourself from oppression, free yourself from the pharaohs, we are now have become the pharaohs to others. And so we need today to reclaim this narrative. We need today to say no to depression, to say no to closing our hearts, to say no to withdrawing, and to say, like they said in that church in Alabama, in that movie, we are here. We'll stand with you. We'll sing with you. We'll dance with you. And together, we shall overcome.